I didn't sign up to be history's first castaway. My job was to monitor signal telemetry and keep an eye on the diagnostics panel, not to get yanked backwards through 66 million years of geological pressure like a string of old code. And yet, here I am, flat on my back, lungs full of sour air, staring up at a sky the wrong shade of blue, ringed with clouds that move like bruises spreading across skin. There was a scream in my ears when I landed, not mine, the machine's. The breach alarm in the transfer chamber wailed just before my vision went white. Then there was the crackle of ozone, like being inside a burning television, and the sudden tearing sensation in my chest, like something peeled the air away. Now, nothing, just silence, broken only by the thrum of insects, too big and too many. I roll onto my side, coughing. The earth beneath me is soft, but not in any modern sense. It's slick and fibrous, as if the ground itself is still undecided whether it's plant or animal. The moss here breathes, literally. As I press my palm into it, I feel it contract, then expand, like lungs, like it noticed me. No modern ecosystem should feel this. Alert. My name is Elias Finch, 35, exobiologist. I was brought onto the Deep Time Initiative because of my work modeling Precambrian ecosystems. Ironically, I was the least important person in the transfer chamber. Dr. McHale oversaw the probe. Lee handled the array's calibration. I just ran the diagnostics on the environmental models being piped back. The whole point of the temporal relay system was observation, robotic, safe, controlled. It was never supposed to move anything but cameras. We weren't even testing temporal retrieval yet, but the array overloaded, and instead of frying our equipment, it opened a one-way hole wide enough to swallow a man. I sit up slowly, taking stock. My jumpsuit is scorched on one side. My gear belt is still strapped to my waist, though most of the tools have been damaged or lost. The backup water pouch is intact. The tablet display is cracked, but miraculously working. The interface reads offline. No signal. I didn't expect otherwise. The only equipment that might still be useful is my field journal, a rugged, waterproof notepad with graphite styluses fused into the spine. I take it out, flip to the first blank page and write, Day 1, arrival point unknown, possibly Maastrichtian or late Campanian. Sky pigmentation suggests elevated sulfur content. Atmospheric pressure, slightly higher than modern baseline. Air breathable but heavy. Estimate altitude near sea level. I pocket the notebook and stand. The forest around me is thick but not in any familiar configuration. These aren't modern trees. The trunks are segmented like bamboo but covered in bark that peels in long hairy ribbons. The leaves are waxy and hang in triangular spirals. A few emit a faint hum when the wind touches them, vibrating like the reed of a woodwind instrument. And then I hear it. The first sound that tells me this is real. Thum, low, rhythmic, ground shaking. The kind of bass note that doesn't just echo, it lives inside your chest. Thum, thum. I freeze, kneeling low. From behind a curtain of hanging ferns, something enormous emerges. Something that would make a bull elephant look like a house cat. I've seen reconstructions, skeleton CG renders. None prepared me. This isn't just a dinosaur. This is an animal, alive, breathing, coiled in muscle and motion. Its skin is a patchwork of armored plates, each lined with what looks like fungal growth or mineral veins. On its back, long ridges arch up like petrified kelp fronds, twitching in response to the breeze. A sauropod maybe, but with far more adaptations than modern reconstructions suggest. Its tail drags not lazily but rhythmically like a metronome. Each movement feels calculated, like it's measuring the forest with vibration, as if sound is part of how it navigates. It doesn't see me, or if it does, I'm beneath notice. It walks on. The ferns rise again and I'm alone. I whisper aloud, I'm not dead. Then, a beat later, I'm not alone, not out here. Something rustles to my right. Fast, light, not the same creature, not even close. I duck down again and slowly rotate. Between two trunks, I catch a glimpse of movement. Low to the ground, a shape slinking through the underbrush, all tail and sinew. I don't get a good look, just the suggestion of a predator, something that walks like a theropod but moves like a hunting cat. Quick, confident, curious, it doesn't approach, just watches. Eventually it vanishes into the foliage. I didn't sleep that first night. The heat bled from the air like blood from a wound, and by dusk, the forest took on a different shape entirely, like it folded in on itself. The breathing moss contracted with the cold, the trees stopped humming, the wind died. The insects grew louder, their wings thrumming like tiny engines, and every so often, something in the canopy cracked with a wet, echoing pop, like a fruit bursting open or a carapace splitting. I wedged myself into the base of a tree, half curled in a pocket formed by tangled roots. I didn't dare build a fire. I couldn't risk drawing attention. I pulled my scorched jumpsuit tighter around my body, using the field journal as insulation over my chest. I watched the stars blink in above the dark leaves. They looked sharper than I remembered, closer almost, like the atmosphere had less haze or something. By morning, my tongue felt like it was coated in dry glue. The backup water pouch had maybe 3 mouthfuls, and I rationed one to get the dryness out of my throat. I needed to find clean water, and soon. Day 2, directionless. Temperature dropped sharply overnight, estimated 48 Fahrenheit. No evidence of modern microbial contaminants in air. Insects active during dark hours, avoid future rest near ground level. Notes, I saw something last night, not sure if it saw me. I tore the page free and tucked it into the binding sheath, then stood and checked my gear again. Nothing new, just what I already knew. Broken tools, cracked tablet, limited survival gear. The styluses clipped to the field journal were still intact at least, and the compass gyro for my diagnostics panel, mounted inside the casing of my now fried telemetry tablet, still responded to magnetic north, though it drifted slightly every few minutes. Either interference from the atmosphere or this planet's magnetic field was fluctuating much more violently than expected, or maybe both. I turned toward the morning sun and started walking. The terrain was uneven but alive with motion, not animals, not even wind, but motion. The plant life swayed even when still. Every vine had the texture of jointed cartilage, and when I brushed against one, it recoiled, flexing like a pulled tendon. Then came the buzzing again, not overhead this time, underfoot, a low rhythmic vibration through the moss. I knelt and placed my palm flat against the surface. The moss had started pulsing again, but this time it wasn't alone. Something was moving beneath it. I stepped back, slowly. The ground undulated, a wave pushing through the moss layer like a ripple beneath a sheet. Then something broke the surface. It looked like a beetle, only not quite. The shell wasn't matte or colored. It was crystalline, like broken quartz, and each segment of its body was translucent and angular, like it had grown from glass. It shimmered with reflected light, even in shadow. It stood the height of my knee. I didn't move. It didn't either. Then, without warning, it flipped onto its back and ejected a stream of clear, bubbling fluid in a sharp arc that narrowly missed my leg and hit a nearby stalk. The stalk immediately began to melt. The fluid hissed and popped, eating through the fibrous outer layer of the plant like acid. I stumbled back, heartbeat pounding. The creature righted itself and skittered off, vanishing beneath the moss layer again. Okay, mental note, don't get sprayed. The caustic properties of the fluid could be useful. If I had anything resembling a container or conductive material, it might serve as a poor man's acid battery. That's assuming I lived long enough to build one. I moved on, slower now, watching each footstep, testing the ground before committing to it. Every so often, I'd see another beetle, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, gliding across the moss layer with a near-silent ripple. Their bodies didn't make noise, but when the sun hit them, their shells refracted like a prism, casting dozens of shimmering specks across the ferns. I came to a clearing just before noon. It wasn't a natural clearing. Something had flattened it, something big. I stepped to the edge and examined the impression in the moss. A wide swath of it had been crushed under massive weight, though not haphazardly. The steps were spaced, patterned, almost rhythmic, like a song with each footfall. Each depression was over 1 meter wide, deeply sunken, and ringed with faint, irregular gouges. Claw marks or gripping pads, maybe. And they went on for hundreds of meters, into the ferns, through the trees, toward a rise in the distance. I followed them. The walk took me the better part of an hour. The sun here didn't travel at the same angle I was used to. It hung low, suspended in the amber-colored sky, and the light had a strange, molasses-thick quality that made the shadows feel sticky and dense. The air buzzed constantly. Insects, yes, but more than that. A pressure, a resonance. Like this place was humming in a register too low to hear but high enough to feel in your teeth. The footprints ended at a basin, and in the center stood a creature that made everything else I'd seen feel like window dressing. It was backlit by the amber sun, towering, slow-moving, impossibly large. Another sauropod. But this one, it wasn't just bigger, it was deliberate. The plates along its spine were feathered, not like bird feathers, but long, keratinous ribbons that trailed in the wind like streamers. They shimmered slightly as though coated in oil. When the wind shifted, they caught the air and tensed like antennae, listening. Its skin was covered in a patchwork of moss and mineral. Growths, fungal blooms. This wasn't just an animal, it was part of the forest. No, more than that. It was the forest. Every step it took sent vibrations through the ground that echoed for minutes afterward. It moved with such deliberate slowness that I couldn't tell where its body ended and the landscape began. It raised its head slowly, turned it toward the wind, and bellowed. A sound so deep I couldn't hear it, only feel it. I watched until it moved on. Then I sat down and recorded everything I saw, not for rescue, not for posterity, but because I had to understand it, because in that moment I realized something simple and terrifying. We had no idea what this world used to be, not even close. The sky stayed amber long after noon, the sun nailed in place like a brass coin, so I walked by its heat instead of its arc. Each step sank an inch into the mossy crust, and every so often I felt the ground pulse back, slow contractions as though the forest were breathing through its skin. The crystal beetles returned in waves. They emerged shoulder high now, some the length of my forearm, shimmering prism shells flexing open to gather light. When shadow crossed them, their shells clouded over. In sunlight they cleared until I could see organs pumping against glassy plates. Photosynthesis in an animal, impossible, except here. I needed water, but the nearest stream might be miles off. I settled for moisture where I could steal it. First problem, acid spray. I hacked a strip of bark from a whip-thin trunk. The inner layer oozed resin that cured almost instantly in open air. I wrapped strips around my hands, sticky side out, then dusted them with dry soil. Crude gloves, but they kept skin off crystal edges. I stalked a solitary beetle while it fed, shells spread wide, rear segments slowly inflating like bellows. When it flipped to vent excess heat, I rammed a broken stylus under the jointed thorax. Clear fluid welled out, sizzling at the metal tip. I angled a scorched sample vial beneath the wound and caught 4 finger widths of liquid before the beetle convulsed and burrowed away. The vial grew warm, battery acid strong enough to etch glass. That might power a relay plate if I ever rebuilt one. Next, water. The root fungus mat breathed damp air through fissures at the base of trunks. I picked the deepest crack and wedged my stylus inside. Condensate beaded along the graphite, slow but steady. I licked drops straight off the metal until my tongue stung from tannins, then filled half my pouch. Bitter, but safe enough. Movement ahead. The moss bulged, but nothing surfaced, just a ripple racing through the carpet, curving wide around me. Predator? I stood still. The ripple tightened into a circle 10 paces out, then collapsed inward like a noose. From the center burst a spider the size of a dinner plate, legs banded in chitin and velvet mold. It snapped up a small beetle, injected something, and waited while its prize collapsed in a hiss of vapor. The spider drank liquefied innards through a proboscis, then folded itself flat and glided beneath the moss again, leaving a steaming dent. Predators everywhere. I kept moving. Mid-afternoon light shifted greenish, filtered through high clouds. Ahead, the trees parted, revealing a shelf of tangled roots like a fallen lattice. A stench, sweet, mineral, faintly electrical, drifted on the breeze. I crept closer and saw the root web descending into a shallow pit where dozens of beetles lay dead, shells cracked open. In the center, a stump-thick root throbbed with pale veins. Each pulse squeezed droplets of clear fluid down its surface into a pool no bigger than a helmet. The liquid sparked faintly, tiny blue arcs dancing across the skin, water charged with bioelectric current. I dipped a fingertip, pins and needles shock, not lethal. I cupped both hands, drank slowly. Metallic taste, but smoother than the fungus condensate. The shock left my lips tingling. I filled the pouch. If I could rig a capacitor, this water alone might jumpstart small circuitry. A low growl rolled through the understory, not the base of a sauropod, but closer, drier, like stone grinding. Branches bowed ahead. Something approached at ground level. I crouched behind a fern pillar. Through the fronds, a new theropod stalked, 2 meters tall, torso lean, tail stiff as a balancing rod. Scales overlapped like fish armor, colored matte slate. What caught me was the head, flattened, eyes wide-set and forward, jaw lined with tooth ridges instead of individual teeth, a crushing clamp rather than a bite. It scanned the clearing, nostrils flaring. The beast paused at the pool, dipped its snout, then jerked back as a spark leapt to its lip. It snorted, shook its head, and stepped around the edge, searching. When it sniffed the air my way, I held breath until lungs burned. It moved off after a minute, stalking deeper into the fern sea. I exhaled, knees weak, and retreated the opposite direction. The forest thinned near sunset. Ahead, a dim glimmer threaded through trunks, the reflective shimmer of open ground. I hurried, branches whipping my arms, and broke onto a high bank. Below stretched a ribbon of what looked like black oil sliding over glass, too uniform for river water, too slow for wind. The surface rippled in square patterns as if tiled. I knelt on the bank and touched the edge. Not water, a living mat. Countless flat cells, each no wider than my nails, slid over each other like liquid shingles. They flashed color each time my finger brushed, first cobalt, then emerald, then back to black. Magnetochromic algae, obedient to field changes. I tossed a pebble in. Rings of color raced outward, turquoise, violet, crimson, then settled, potential energy everywhere. A plan formed, a relay dish framed in driftwood, lined with reflective crystal shards, coated in this algae as variable resistor. A living antenna. And the forest might provide it all, if I survived long enough to collect the parts. The amber sun finally dipped, bleeding red into treetops. I hiked uphill until I found a cluster of broadleaf plants whose stems exhaled warm vapor. I bent branches into a crude lean-to, stacked damp leaves for bedding, and wedged myself inside before the cold came. No fire tonight either. Sparks draw eyes. I logged briefly. Day 2. Resources: acid battery fluid acquired, conductive water source located, magnetochromic algae river 2 kilometers east. Hazards: crystal beetle acid, burrowing spiders, theropod variant, jaw press predator. Objective: gather driftwood for frame, locate piezo crystals for dish core. Pen lifted. I closed the journal and listened to night claim the canopy. Far off, the jaw-press predator barked, short, percussive notes. From deeper forest came the seismic heartbeat of the sauropod choir, low and distant. My world narrowed to the warm leaf tent, the charge buzzing on my tongue, and the steady promise that tomorrow might reveal the first real tool toward home. Sleep finally took me with the insects humming lullaby somewhere just under the ground. I broke camp before full light, half frozen but alive. The leaf tent had done its job. A thin layer of condensation slicked my jumpsuit, and when I stood, a warm column of steam rose off me into the air. The trees around me were humming again, soft vibrations in the trunks like tuning forks wrapped in bark. I headed east, back toward the algae flow. I didn't need to guess direction. I felt it in the air like a tug on my molars. The river, if I could call it that, had a presence. The kind of slow, steady pull you get from standing too close to something massive. Not gravity, just importance. I reached it by mid-morning. The light was different this time. Brighter, sharper. The sun had edged higher into the sky, and the algae mat had responded in kind. The surface now shimmered with geometric color bands that moved independently of the current, like a layer of liquid LCD pixels. It wasn't just reacting to wind or sunlight, it was responding to itself, one part triggering another in a loop. A living computer. I squatted at the edge of the flow and dipped a stick into the mat. The cells nearest the intrusion turned black, repelled the wood, then slowly reabsorbed the space once I withdrew. Self-healing. The conductivity here wasn't theoretical. With the right leads and enough surface contact, this whole river could become a relay dish. I followed it upstream. The banks thickened with reeds, thick, waxy tubes that pulsed faintly with blue light just under the surface. Some swayed even without wind. I cut one open with a shard of flint and found a clear gel inside, warm and slightly viscous. The scent was faintly metallic but not unpleasant. I dabbed it onto the cracked face of my tablet. The instant the gel spread across the screen, the tablet flickered. For half a second, I saw an interface stutter back to life, just enough to flash the Deep Time logo. Then it shut off again. The battery was long dead. Still, the gel was conductive, probably laced with trace metals from the root systems below. I filled a leaf cup with it, covered the top with moss, and tied it off with reed fibers. As I walked, the flow narrowed. Eventually it led into a wide trench, too smooth to be natural, too uniform. Algae clung to the inner sides of the channel in precise vertical bands, the color changing every few meters like a graduated spectrum. The floor was hard-packed but warm to the touch, like it retained heat from underground. The trench terminated at a basin, a perfect circle, maybe 15 meters across, rimmed with segmented stone columns. Algae pooled at the bottom, swirling in concentric rings. Something had built this, not recently, not by hand, but built or formed or coaxed into shape. I stood at the edge and looked down. My reflection stared back, blurred by movement, twisted by the swirling currents. It felt like the water was trying to form a shape out of me, like it was searching for a pattern. I stepped back, a sound behind me, low, like wood creaking under strain. I turned slowly. A creature stood at the edge of the reeds, duck-billed, tall, maybe 15 feet at the shoulder. It was covered in gray-blue skin pocked with nodules, and its throat ballooned out in a wide, translucent sail, like a frog mid-croak, only larger than my entire torso. The crest on its head curved back like a tuning fork. It stood motionless for a long beat. Then, without warning, it sang. The throat sail expanded, catching sunlight, and let out a vibrating trill that felt like it came from inside my own bones. The sound wasn't loud. It was deep, so low it made the ground shiver. Other calls echoed in response, from across the trench, from deep in the trees, dozens of them. A herd. The creature turned its head toward me, not hostile, just aware. Then it moved on, feet pressing gentle ridges into the moss, tail trailing behind like a shadow. Moments later, 3 more coral soars followed, each with different sail shapes and tonal calls, like a living wind instrument ensemble. I waited until the last one passed before descending into the basin. The algae was denser here. When I stepped in, The cells shifted around my boots but didn't reject me. I crouched and pressed my palm to the water. It was warm, conductive. The pattern of current pulses was precise, like a heartbeat or a code. With the right setup, this place could serve as a capacitor. The basin held energy. It responded to touch. It might even store signals. The plan was forming piece by piece: driftwood from the nesting beaches for framing, piezo crystals from ridge slopes for current transduction, shell fragments as plates, acid beetle fluid for temporary power, gel from reeds as conductor, and this basin, this exact spot, as the activation point. I still had no way to trigger a return relay, but if I could build a working dish and modulate it through vibration or heat, I might reach something, anything, the deep time satellite net, a probe array, even just open space. If the hole that dropped me here opened once, maybe it could open again, or maybe not, but I had to try. As I stepped out of the basin, a low vibration passed through the air, not a call, not a quake. It came from the east, where the algae flow curved away into the distance. It wasn't a sound, it was absence, a sudden void in the constant hum of insects, a gap. The forest held its breath. Whatever was coming didn't move fast, but it made everything else stop. I backed away from the trench, heart pounding, and climbed into the thick brush uphill. No movement yet, just the silence, unnatural, expectant. I didn't wait for it to break. I turned west, toward higher ground, and ran. The higher I climbed, the thinner the trees became, until the dense forest thinned into something more like a jungle canopy stretched over loose rock and dry scrub. The moss gave way to spongy lichen that crackled underfoot, and the buzzing that had vanished with the silence returned, only now it was sharper, not ambient. Directed, I was being followed. The ridge opened onto a plateau bathed in golden light. It should have been breathtaking. Steep cliffs to my left, open sky to my right, the forest a shivering carpet below. But I didn't stop to take it in, because I heard the wings. They didn't hum, they sang, high, piercing notes like flutes tuned too tight, 1,000 of them. And they were closing in. I ducked low behind a ridge of basalt. The stone here was strange, glass smooth in parts, like it had melted and reformed mid-flow. Thin vertical tubes of crystal jutted out from the surface like broken tuning forks. I broke one off, its end jagged and sharp, and stashed it in my belt loop. Then I turned to look at what was chasing me. The swarm crested the ridge with terrifying grace. A tornado of translucent wings, thin as plastic wrap and each the size of a man's forearm, filled the air. The insects underneath were long-bodied and thin, with legs folded tight against their torsos and abdomens that shimmered with fluid. Their eyes were compound but forward-facing, predator eyes, and their mouths, they didn't sting, they bit, row after row of tiny razor-lined mandibles clamping, clicking, twitching in anticipation. I pressed my back against the rock, then broke into a sprint across the open ground. The swarm followed immediately, no hesitation, no circling, just a direct line. They weren't foraging, they were hunting. The glasswing flies moved with uncanny synchronization, banking as one body, pivoting midair like a school of fish. As I ran, I saw flashes of light off their wings, tiny, kaleidoscopic refractions. They bent the sun itself into color, blinding, disorienting. I veered down a narrow gully, hoping the walls would disrupt their flight. It worked, partially. The vanguard of the swarm clipped the rock face and shattered like thrown glass, bodies tumbling, wings folding. But more followed, unbothered. One brushed my arm, immediate pain, like needles dragging across skin. Blood welled through torn fabric. I dropped to the ground, rolled behind a spire of basalt, and fumbled with my pack. I still had the sap vial from the crystal beetle. I dipped the end of a stick in it, lit it with the emergency spark strip embedded in the journal's spine, and waved the flaming branch toward the swarm. They recoiled. Not much, but enough. The smoke did something to them. Maybe the acid disrupted their sensory nodes, or the heat refracted off their transparent wings in a way they couldn't handle. I fed more dry moss onto the stick and kept waving. The swarm slowed, circling instead of diving. I seized the opportunity and moved fast, using the narrow rock channels as cover. My boots skidded across loose shale, and several times I had to throw myself behind a stone outcrop to avoid the next dive. 10 minutes later, they gave up. They peeled away with eerie silence, lifting back into the sky in a single fluid spiral, and vanished into the upper thermals. I collapsed into the shade of a lava overhang, heart hammering. My arm bled openly now, and I tore off a strip of cloth to wrap it. The pain was manageable, shallow bites, no venom, but the attack confirmed something I'd only suspected before. This world didn't want me dead through accident or chance. It had predators, and I was officially on the menu. After binding the wound, I studied the basalt around me. The crystal tubes embedded in the rock weren't uniform. Some hummed faintly when I tapped them, resonant tones at specific frequencies. A few cracked under pressure and revealed hollow cores filled with fibrous strands like natural wiring. I took several fragments and tied them into a bundle with reed fibers. These would make ideal anchors for the dish, lightweight, conductive, responsive to vibration. If I could align them properly, they might even work as directional channels for the signal. A distant thud echoed up the ridge. Not a predator this time. A step. Heavy, measured. I froze and pressed against the stone. The thud came again, closer. I risked a glance over the ridge and saw a shape emerge from the far end of the plateau. A new dinosaur, quadrupedal, low-slung, maybe the size of a rhinoceros. Its back was covered in ridged plates that curved outward like fins, each one pulsing faintly with a yellow glow. A set of translucent flaps extended from its flanks, waving with each step, like jellyfish tentacles. It paused, sniffed the ground, then opened its mouth and exhaled. The sound was not vocal, it was electric. A low thrumming buzz rolled out across the stone, and every crystal around me vibrated. Some even sparked faintly. The creature wasn't communicating, it was charging. The theory I'd tested with a conductive water and sap was now confirmed. This ecosystem wasn't just electric, it ran on it. Certain species were wired into the very frequency of their environment. That meant a properly constructed relay dish, if tuned to the right bioelectric range, might do more than transmit a signal. It might wake something up, or trigger a response. I stayed silent until the creature moved on, then quietly marked its direction and returned to the narrow rock channel. My arm ached, my throat was dry, but I had new tools now, and more importantly, a clearer picture of how this world worked. The only question left was whether I could build something fast enough before another swarm found me. The next ridge was steep. I had to crawl the last 20 feet, fingers bleeding from sharp gravel, every breath harder than the last. Not because of altitude, but because the air here moved differently. It didn't blow. It surged, as if it weren't wind at all, but atmosphere being pulled and pushed by something I couldn't see. Pressure systems reversed themselves in seconds. One moment a cold draft roared over the ridge, and the next, warm air rushed up from below like a furnace. I crested the summit and dropped to my knees, sucking air through my teeth. Ahead stretched a high shelf of layered stone, obsidian black, polished by ancient wind. The plateau fanned out toward a sheer drop-off, the horizon smeared in orange haze. Trees dotted the cliff edge, sparse and twisted, their bark feathered and iridescent. One tree in particular stood out. It had grown sideways, completely horizontal, perfectly aligned with the wind. I wasn't alone. Halfway across the shelf, something moved. It crawled low, limbs jointed like a mantis, the body long and narrow. Then it stood upright on two legs. A raptor of some kind, definitely theropod, but not any I'd seen reconstructed. The arms were elongated, fingers jointed wrong, with a stretched membrane running from wrist to hip. Not wings, not exactly. Gliding limbs. I backed against a stone column and watched. The creature tested the air with one hand, then sprinted forward and leapt into the void. It didn't fall, it coasted, wings rigid, body flattened. A gull, if a gull had claws and a mouth full of tearing teeth. The thing banked into a slow curve, vanishing below the ridge. A second followed, then a third. There was a nesting colony here. I moved carefully toward the far edge, picking my path between slick stones. My goal wasn't to watch raptors, it was to find the crystals. This was the type of exposed slope where volcanic glass sometimes formed piezoelectric pockets. Quartz, tourmaline, maybe even something rarer. I needed shards that could store and emit charge when compressed. Near the wind-sculpted tree, I found my first one, a hexagonal column buried in a hollow where runoff had carved the stone soft. It pulsed faintly under my fingers. The shape was perfect. I cracked it loose with my crystal shard and wrapped it in moss for protection. I found another 10 before the wind shifted hard again, this time upwards. The first raptor returned. It didn't glide in. It dropped, hit the rock like a falling net, legs extended, wings snapping out to full span. It was fast, faster than anything that size should be. And when it moved, it didn't make a sound. It hadn't seen me yet. I ducked behind a boulder, heart hammering. Another raptor circled overhead. If they nested here, I was in the kill zone. I crouched low and reached for my tools. I still had sap from the beetle, moss wrap for smoke, and a handful of reflective shards I'd picked up near the trench. I arranged them on a flat piece of stone, angling the mirrors outward. I waited. When the second raptor dropped, I struck the sap torch and shoved it behind the mirror shards. The smoke spread fast, curling in irregular spirals, gray against the light, almost oily. The raptor landed, flared its gliding limbs, then paused. Its head turned, not toward me, toward the mirrors. The light caught its eye, the reflected flicker from the smoke. The raptor hissed low, then stepped closer, fascinated. I threw a shard. It clattered behind the creature. It spun and charged toward the sound, away from me. I bolted. Every step was loud, even over the wind. My boots skidded on glassy stone. One raptor screeched behind me. A second dropped ahead. I pivoted, using the incline to slide downhill, arms tucked, breath held. The ledge dropped again. I flung myself behind a stone column just as one glider swept past, wings clipping the rock. I scrambled downslope, ducking through narrow gaps in the stone, wind howling louder by the second. They didn't follow. They circled once, then vanished into the thermals. Either I wasn't worth it, or they'd learned the stone worked against them. I didn't stop moving until I was back in tree cover. There, beneath a squat tree with fronds like twisted blades, I unpacked what I'd scavenged. 11 crystal shards, 3 piezo rods, 1 partially intact resonator core. Each piece gleamed faintly, alive. When I pressed 2 rods together, the contact points sparked, weak but real. I tested the acid sap across the junction. It hissed, then surged. It wasn't much, but it meant the dish could hold charge, could respond. The wind thinned as the sun dipped lower. I pressed a crystal shard into the dirt and watched it glow faintly in rhythm with the surrounding trees. Not random. Everything here pulsed in some pattern I hadn't cracked yet. And somewhere in that pattern, maybe, just maybe, was a signal I could hijack, or one that was already trying to reach me. But I'd need more power, more structure, and something to lift the dish high enough to clear the canopy. The sky was turning violet. Night would come soon. I recorded in my field journal. Day 3, first gliders encountered. Extremely fast, silent, nest on basalt ridge. Retrieved viable piezoelectric crystal stock. Acid sap plus moss smoke repels gliders. Resonator spark confirmed. Dish possible. Signal not yet. Tomorrow I'd need driftwood, and I'd need to descend. Back toward the shore. Back to where the big ones nested. By morning the forest had shifted again. The humidity was almost unbearable, clinging to my skin like wet cotton, and the air carried the sharp, briny smell of a vast body of water nearby. I headed downhill. The terrain leveled out, then dropped abruptly into a salt-flat valley that shimmered in the sun. Beyond it, maybe a mile out, I caught my first glimpse of the inland sea. The water wasn't blue. It was an oily metallic gray, rippling without wind, almost as if it were being stirred from below. Getting closer meant crossing the salt crust. The ground here popped underfoot, riddled with spidery cracks that hissed out warm vapor when stepped on. I tested each patch before moving, skirting where the crust looked too thin. Half an hour later, I reached the edge. The shore wasn't sand or rock, it was bone. Dozens, no, hundreds of curved shells, broken ribs, and mineralized plates carpeted the ground. It crunched with every step. Most were sun-bleached and ancient, but scattered among them were fresh carcasses. Some no bigger than house cats, others the size of compact cars. I recognized a few shapes, plesiosaurs, early marine crocs, but most were things we never cataloged. Fin spines, external throat sacs, rotary jointed jaws. And then I saw the nesting site. A rise of pale earth jutted into the sea like a tongue. Dozens of creatures were moving slowly across it, massive, long-necked marine reptiles dragging their bulk out of the surf and flopping onto the ridge. Each had long flippers, tails like whips, and skulls that split vertically when they yawned, revealing double-jointed jaws lined with filter teeth. But the strangest thing? They were beating their fins not just a crawl but in rhythm, a pattern. Each flap of their wing-like limbs stirred the sand into ripples. The bodies moved in sync, creating waves that cooled the freshly laid eggs scattered in pits along the rise. The motion fanned heat from below and kept the soft, leathery eggs from cooking in the midday sun. Thermoregulation, coordinated, deliberate. I stayed low and out of sight, circling wide until I reached the drift zone. Here, the tide had pushed piles of organic debris into mounds, twisted roots, seaweed, crusted resin, splintered bone, and wood. Real, fossilized wood, drifted in from ancient trees or long flooded forests. Most of it had been softened by salt water, but I found a dozen pieces still rigid and dry beneath the top layer. The largest was a curved beam about 5 feet long, already split at one end. With a few clean breaks, it would serve as the first arch of my relay frame. I bundled what I could carry, 2 beams, 3 half-length staves, and a mass of fibrous seaweed, and tied them together with reed rope. The resin would keep the frame water-resistant once I coated it. As I turned to leave, something moved under the drift pile. Slow, deliberate. I froze. A ripple passed through the wood mound, lifting a curled chunk of kelp like a breathing chest. Then a gleam, iridescent and segmented, slid through the filth. A beetle, but unlike any I'd seen. This one was the size of a dog, its shell rimmed with sharp ridges that clicked as it moved. Its back housed small translucent sacs that inflated and deflated with faint hisses. It wasn't hunting, it was scavenging. A second one emerged nearby, then a third. I backed up slowly, the driftwood bundle on my shoulder. One of the beetles noticed me. Its head snapped in my direction, antennae curling toward my scent. I stepped back again. It charged. I dropped the bundle and sprinted, feet skidding over shell fragments and wet salt, claws clicking behind me like castanets. One beetle leapt from a ledge and clipped my side midair. Its shell split on impact, spraying a sticky white goo that burned like jellyfish venom. I rolled, grabbed a bone fragment the length of my forearm, and swung it as the second beetle lunged. The blow shattered its antennae and sent it spinning. I ran, not back the way I came, but into the nesting site. It was a risk. The marine reptiles might be aggressive, but the beetles wouldn't follow there. Too much mass, too much motion. I ducked behind a half-buried plesiosaur skull and watched the beetles skitter to a halt at the edge of the ridge. They didn't dare cross. A deep rumble rolled through the sand. One of the nesting giants raised its head and let out a mournful cry. Long, low, almost like a whale's call underwater. The sound vibrated through my chest, then silence. Even the beetles retreated. I waited until the sun started to fall before moving again. This time I went wide, north around the inlet, carrying only half the driftwood bundle to avoid another ambush. It would take multiple trips, but I wasn't going to get greedy. By dusk, I'd ferry the last of it back to the tree line. I chose a spot just uphill, where the ground stayed dry and firm, and stacked the pieces carefully. The frame would be crude, but it would stand. One arch for elevation, cross beams for the dish face, quartz and crystal embedded at contact points, conductive reed gel smeared over contact nodes, and maybe, just maybe, a pulse strong enough to reach something still listening. That night, I made a fire, just a small one. I figured the big ones wouldn't care, and the beetles wouldn't dare come that close again. I barely slept. The fire kept the immediate dark at bay, but out here, darkness wasn't the enemy, it was what came alive inside it. The forest below the hilling didn't quiet down when the sun vanished. It shifted. The usual drone of insects faded, replaced by long, drawn-out groans that echoed up from the canopy. Shapes moved beneath the trees, some tall, some fast, some in pairs or herds. I didn't see any clearly. I didn't want to. So I kept the fire small, just enough to cook a few soft-shelled eggs I'd scavenged near the plesiosaur nests. They reeked like sulfur but tasted almost normal once charred. I was halfway through the second one when the forest lit up, not from above, from below. Pale green light blinked on and scattered pulses across the slope, then more, in deeper shades of blue and violet. No pattern at first, just distant glows, like someone lighting lanterns in the brush. Then I heard the hooting, a low, reedy call that echoed between the trees like a hunting horn. One short burst, then two, then three in rapid sequence, answered by another series from somewhere to the east. Something stepped into view, 30 yards downhill. Four-legged, heavily muscled, frilled neck, a ceratopsian. But unlike any in the fossil record, the first thing I noticed was the horns. They weren't solid bone. Each curved horn was lined with grooves that glowed from within, like veins of phosphorus. The center frill bloomed outward like a satellite dish, semi-translucent, pulsing with bioluminescent light in complex patterns. When it moved, the glow shifted. It wasn't ambient, it was responsive. A second one followed, slightly smaller with different frill markings and horn shapes, then a third, and a fourth. They were walking in formation. A mating display? Social bonding? No, the patterns didn't repeat. Each new flash seemed to answer the last. A dialogue. Language by light. The herd spread out through the lower clearing, at least 10 by the time I stopped counting. Each took up position, frills forward, glowing softly. They moved with slow precision, step, blink, call, like they were performing a ritual. I watched, heart thudding, not out of fear this time, but awe. I'd never seen anything this complex in a supposed herbivore. Suddenly, the lead male lifted its head sharply. The lights across its body brightened, and its vocalization dropped into a deep, reverberating groan. Every other ceratopsian froze. Then, movement in the trees behind them. Small shapes, predators. I saw at least 6, sleek, fast, dromaeosaur-like. Feathers tipped in iridescent barbs, not a frontal attack. A surround. But the herd didn't panic. Instead, the largest 3 ceratopsians stepped forward, frills alight, and blared. The sound was physical, hit me like standing too close to a subwoofer. The light flashed in a synchronized pattern across their frills, sharp white pulses in 4 directions, each timed with a vocal burst. The predators hesitated. One darted forward, then stopped. Another crept closer, then backed away. It wasn't the noise that stopped them. It was the light. The flashes weren't just for communication, they were a weapon. A non-lethal threat display that scrambled the vision of anything trying to flank them. No need for a charge, just hold position, blind the approach, and wait. The predators vanished into the trees after less than a minute. The herd stayed still, perfectly aligned until the last one was gone. Then, slowly the lights dimmed. The frills folded down, the calls softened to short, rhythmic hoots, and they resumed their walk. I realized, standing there on that ridge, what I was seeing wasn't just a survival tactic. This wasn't primitive behavior. This was cultural, ceremony. They were performing it the same way every night, I was sure of it. A coordinated act passed down, not genetically but by example. A learned response, maybe even one with meaning deeper than survival. I stepped back from the firelight and sat quietly with the journal, careful not to let even the tip of my stylus flash in their direction. Day 4, Ceratopsian encounter. Bioluminescent frill signaling confirmed social coordination. Light used in threat display. Rejected prior assumptions, not dumb, not solitary, not primitive. Cultural elements possible. I wrote until the last of them vanished back into the woods. The fire died out not long after. I didn't relight it. That night, I lay curled beneath the driftwood arch frame, crystal shards humming faintly in the cool air. The completed relay dish was still far off, but I'd gathered enough to feel the weight of it in my bones. If I could get the frame upright, if I could rig the algae channels, if I could time the pulses, then maybe, just maybe, I could send something, a ping, a distress signal, or a message that simply said, "I'm here." I woke to thunder, not in the sky, beneath me. The ground shuddered with a wet slapping rhythm, and the smell hit before I even sat up. Pungent, rotted. Swamp stink thick with sulfur and decay. I climbed out from under the driftwood arch and looked east, where a haze of vapor rolled in from the tree line. A swamp. Not just wet ground. A living bog, where the air itself sweated and the mud burped every few minutes like something just beneath the surface was breathing in reverse. I didn't want to go in. But the relay dish needed charge, more than sap or reed gel could provide. The crystal anchors hummed faintly now, but they needed real current, the kind of sustained voltage that could pulse for hours. Something in this ecosystem had to hold or emit enough bioelectric energy to give the dish life. And based on yesterday's encounter with the glowing marine saurians and the flashing ceratopsians, it wasn't going to be a machine, it'd be alive. So I followed the sound of thunder. The swamp began gently. Moss gave way to soft mud. My boots sank a few inches with every step. Insects swarmed instantly, most just buzzing, a few the size of walnuts that dive-bombed my neck until I covered my skin with a paste of crushed leaves and algae. It helped, a little. I moved slower now, 1 foot at a time, every step tested before putting weight down. The mud sucked at my boots, and if I paused too long, I'd start to sink. The current in the air grew stronger. Not water, not wind, charge. A background static in the back of my teeth, hair standing up on my arms. That same hum I'd felt near the volt creature at the cliff now buzzed through the soles of my feet. That's when I saw it, half submerged in the bog, only its ridged spine and nostrils above water, a crocodilian, but far larger than any I'd ever seen. 30 feet long, maybe more. Skin like river stone, no visible eyes, just small, twitching whiskers along its snout and a ridge of glowing pits that pulsed gently, soft blue-white light that faded and returned in time with the tremor in the ground. A bioelectric predator. Its entire back was lined with nodules, some flat, some raised, like coral growths. Every few seconds, the light across them pulsed again, and the water around it twitched. Not rippled, twitched, as if a signal had gone through it, an electric field, wide as the entire bog. The beast was asleep, or resting. Either way, not active, which meant I had a window. I needed 2 things. 1, a way to store its field charge. 2, a way to leave without getting eaten. I slid around the perimeter of the bog, careful not to splash. Near the edge, a root system had tangled around a rock outcrop. Between the roots were slimy patches of egg-like bulbs, glowing faintly blue. I reached in. The bulbs snapped shut around my hand. Not a plant, not an egg, a siphon, alive, reactive. It tightened, then loosened, and suddenly I felt a shock shoot up my arm. Not painful, just startling. The charge passed into my muscles and out just as fast. I yanked my arm back and stared. My skin glowed where it touched the creature. Then it faded. Capacitor jelly, that's what it was. A biological conductor, possibly a medium used by scavengers or parasites to absorb ambient charge in the swamp. If I could gather enough of them, and if they'd hold charge once separated, I might be able to transplant that energy into the dish circuit. I harvested 7. Carefully. 2 snapped shut on my fingers. 1 released a sharp chemical odor that left my nose bleeding for 20 minutes. I stored them in a cracked turtle shell I'd found upstream, padding the interior with damp moss to keep them from drying out. And that's when the voltage spike hit. I didn't see the strike. I felt it. The crocodilian surged to life, mouth opening in complete silence, body rising out of the mud like a submarine surfacing. A rapid flick of its tail sent a wave across the bog that shattered low branches from trees 20 feet up. Electricity rippled outward from its body in concentric pulses, visible in the water like the inside of a Tesla coil. The air lit up with static. I froze behind the root cluster, holding my breath, every hair on my body standing straight. The creature didn't chase, didn't even hunt. It just moved, slowly, repositioning, searching. Its jaws opened and closed in a slow rhythm, not biting, sampling the air. Then it turned toward the western edge of the bog and slid back beneath the surface without a sound. Gone. I exhaled hard and bolted, not toward the ridge I came from. Too risky. I circled the opposite side, angling for high ground until the stench of rot gave way to dry lichen and the voltage hum died off. When I finally stopped, I checked the jelly bulbs. Still glowing, still intact. I'd lost a boot in the mud. My hands were raw from thorns, but I had them. Power cells, and more than that, proof. This world didn't just produce electricity, it depended on it. Light, communication, defense, motion. Everything had evolved to run on voltage, not just biology. And if I could tap into that, if I could speak the same signal, maybe something listening would answer back, or maybe something would come to turn me off. I didn't care either way. Tomorrow I'd start testing voltage transfer between the jelly bulbs and the relay's crystal nodes, and if it sparked, I'd aim it skyward. The relay frame stood now, crooked, lashed together with resin and reed, but tall. I'd anchored it in a clearing above the ridge, wedging the driftwood base between roots that pulsed warm when the morning sun hit them. But I needed more height, a platform for the dish, something above the canopy line, and without tools or scaffolding, I needed to find height, not build it. So I went looking for towers. It didn't take long. 2 kilometers south, the trees parted around a structure that didn't belong. At first I thought it was a cliff, a sheer, tan spire rising from the forest floor. Then I noticed the movement. The entire surface was alive. Termites, or their ancient cousins. Each no bigger than my thumb, they worked in swarms, layering fibers, scraping moss, dragging pulp in vertical chains. The spire pulsed faintly, vents opening and closing to regulate temperature. It wasn't just a hive, it was engineered. Chimneys at the top released faint vapor in rhythmic bursts. Cooling cycles. The structure had to be at least 60 meters tall, hollow, probably full of chambers, and most important, dry. The inner heat meant dry stone, dry air, and, with luck, high access to unobstructed sky. I waited until midday, when most of the swarm retreated into shaded chambers, then approached from the leeward side. The base was pocked with openings, some barely large enough for an arm, others wide enough to crawl through. I found a narrow one, sloped upward, and began the climb. Inside, the air was thick with resin and the dry rot smell of cellulose. The walls were lined with fibrous silk, moisture-wicking threads that twitched when touched. I climbed slowly, placing feet on hardened ridges, hands gripping columns that pulsed faintly. At 20 meters, I passed the first chamber. Dozens of larvae the size of rats squirmed in a bed of chewed fungus. fed by drones with flattened heads that regurgitated liquid into open mouths. I didn't stop to look closer. At 30 meters, the heat grew worse. My skin slicked with sweat, and the inner air pressed in like a fever. I paused at a vent shaft, one of the outer chimneys, and angled my head toward the sky. Clear view, unbroken sky, perfect signal path. I climbed another 5 meters, pressed my back against a load-bearing column, and removed a jelly bulb from the shell, still glowing. I wedged one of the crystal nodes into a vent split and pushed the bulb against it. No visible spark, but the hum that passed through the shaft deepened. I placed my palm over the node and felt the vibration increase. It was working, not enough for a pulse, but enough for a link. I pressed a second bulb against the column, then a third. One by one, I felt the resonance increase, a tuning fork held in the ribs. The entire spire carried charge upward. This could work. I'd need to relay the signal back to the dish frame somehow, use the tower as a power station, maybe route charge via piezo cords or beetle sap, if I could insulate it well enough. But this structure was key. I sat there in the dark for a long time, letting my breathing slow, my body cool. I scribbled notes, measurements, voltage estimates, pressure gradients from the chimneys. Every number mattered. Then I heard the change, not from above, below. The hum dropped. A thudding vibration rippled up through the shaft. Something had entered the tower. Not a termite, something heavier. I clung to the wall and held still. The sound of resin cracking, the shifting rasp of claws. I edged up another meter and found a horizontal chamber. Slid inside. Dark, tight. I didn't breathe. Something crawled past the shaft entrance, a silhouette against the sunlight filtering down, long-bodied, jointed limbs. Not an insect, a reptile maybe, adapted to live inside these towers, a nest raider. I saw a tongue flick out, long and forked, tasting the air. It paused, head tilted. Then it moved on. I waited 5 full minutes before exiting the chamber. Climbed another 10 meters, finally reaching a crown chamber just below the highest vent. From here, the forest looked tiny, green carpet stretching to the curved horizon. The sky was deep blue now, almost black at the top. No clouds, no haze, perfect. I mounted the last jelly bulb beside the highest vent, pressed the crystal into it, watched the glow intensify. The relay frame below would need to see this. Once I returned, I'd finished binding the dish face. Piezo crystals embedded across the arch, algae gel smeared over the contact lines. This tower would pump the charge upward, and the dish would focus it. I climbed down faster, sliding in places, catching myself on fiber strands. My legs shook by the time I hit the forest floor. The tower behind me pulsed in silence. Tomorrow I'd sync the two systems, and then I'd listen. If the past was still echoing, I'd find it, or if the present was still watching, I'd call to it. The dish was nearly complete. By dawn, I'd set the frame upright on the ridge and locked it into place with root anchors and resin. I laced the driftwood arc with piezo crystals, wedged between slits of hardened bark. The jelly bulbs were wired along the base, each pulsing in rhythm, their light almost imperceptible in daylight. The algae gel smeared across the contact points was beginning to dry, forming a translucent membrane. I just needed one last element, a catalyst. Something that could push the dish past ambient hum and into an actual broadcast. It needed heat, pressure, possibly vibration, something natural I could harness. I remembered the drumming, the resonatosaurus, but that would come later. First, I had to find something to stabilize the edges of the dish, some material to buffer the pulse and prevent the charge from bleeding into the soil. So I descended into the plains. The grass here was unnatural, not just tall but sharp. Each blade was made of fine silica fibers so thin they shimmered in sunlight like sheets of spun glass. I wrapped my legs in leaf fiber to avoid being sliced open, but the protection wouldn't last long. Movement to the west caught my attention, low to the ground. Fast, coordinated. I froze. 3 shapes darted through the grass line, no taller than my waist, but quick, too quick for any sauropod young or herbivore. I climbed a low ridge of earth and got a better view. They were hunting. Feathered predators, dromaeosaurids most likely, but they didn't look like what I'd seen in the reconstructions. Their bodies were narrow and long-limbed, covered in dark feathers that shimmered with a waxy sheen. But the heads, they had crests, frilled cobra-like extensions flared from the neck, feathered in bright reds and deep blues. When one of them flared its hood, the color shifted, pulsing in a wave. The others responded in kind. Then I understood. They weren't just using vision, they were signaling. Light and color as a form of spoken instruction, tactical commands, rapid positioning cues. Their movement wasn't chaotic, it was choreographed. A herd of small quadrupeds, some kind of grazing creature with armor-plated backs, was migrating across the open plain, unaware. The dromaeosaurs fanned out. A coordinated light sequence flickered across their hoods. The pack struck, blinding speed. The first burst toward the herd, flashing white and yellow across its crest, drawing attention. The prey panicked, turned, right into the waiting jaws of the others. It was done in 30 seconds. They didn't eat right away, just stood in formation around the kill, hoods flared, watching, like they knew something else might come. Then I stepped on a loose stone. It clattered. Every head turned at once. I didn't move. One of them stared longer than the rest. It flared blue, brief, almost cautious, then lowered its hood and turned back to the kill. Dismissed. I backed away slowly and circled wide around the ridge. The interaction told me everything I needed. Light meant more than defense here. It was command, hierarchy, even restraint. These weren't berserkers. They were tacticians. I collected what I came for, shards of frayed silica grass, already severed by wind or hooves, and wrapped them in damp bark to keep from cutting my fingers. They were strong enough to act as insulation on the dish rim and thin enough to bend under heat. When I turned back toward the ridge, I found myself walking directly into the wind and realized something strange. The entire grassland sang. Each blade vibrated at a slightly different frequency. The closer they grew to one another, the louder the resonance. The whole plain was like a giant string instrument tuned by the wind. That's when it hit me. The catalyst. The grass itself was an amplifier. If I embedded strands around the rim and angled the dish into the prevailing wind, I could force a resonance frequency that would energize the crystals. If I synchronized it with the tower's charge pulses, I wouldn't need a drumming dinosaur. The wind would be my percussion. I returned to the ridge by dusk. The dish now stood nearly 2 meters tall, laced with bark strips, crystal nodes, algae gel, and glass grass filaments twisted along the edges. I angled the face slightly upward, toward the open sky and the far spire tower. The tower, even from here, blinked faintly, its chimneys pulsing in perfect intervals. Heat rose from it in shimmering columns. If it held steady through the night, I could attempt the first test tomorrow at sunrise. I made camp beside the dish and kept my fire low. The wind shifted through the trees, and somewhere in the dark, I heard the featherhood raptors call again. A soft sequence of chirps and low pulses. They were still watching. Maybe they were always watching. I opened the journal. Day 5. Saw coordinated predator hunt. Confirmed color signaling as communication. Possible synesthetic exchange. Collected silica grass for dish amplifier. Dish now complete minus final alignment and tower sync. First test tomorrow. I closed the book and stared at the stars. They hadn't changed. Same constellations, same void, but I felt farther from them than ever. At dawn, I calibrated the dish. Each strand of glass grass vibrated with the wind, a low collective hum that resonated through the arch. The crystal nodes flickered faintly. Nothing bright, nothing active, but awake. I tethered the jelly bulbs at the base to the longest crystal in the center spine, my best conductor, and checked the alignment one last time. Facing east, slight elevation, Tower in sightline. Everything was ready, except a pulse. The grass hum alone wasn't enough to trigger a directional burst. It kept the dish active, yes, but I needed something else, something massive, to shake the system into function. I remembered the vibration, days ago, deep, rhythmic, like the ground itself breathing. I packed a canteen, a stylus, a sap torch, and went hunting. It didn't take long. By mid-morning, the forest floor changed. Less moss, more packed clay. Trees were spaced wider apart, and the air grew warmer. The underbrush here bent without resistance, shaped by the frequent passage of something too large to argue with. Then came the first footprint, circular, 2 meters across, pressed into the clay so deeply that groundwater pooled in the center. I followed them for nearly an hour, each spaced wider than I could run. Then I heard it. Whum. The sound didn't echo. It lived. It saturated the bones, a subsonic wave that seemed to arrive before the actual noise. Whum. I dropped to a crouch, eyes scanning the tree line, and then it emerged. The forest parted as a creature the size of a battleship stepped into view. 40 meters long, maybe more. A sauropod, clearly, but nothing like the ones reconstructed in museums. Its back was lined with massive, curved plates, like canyon walls, each one hollowed into a drum shape. As it walked, those plates flexed slightly. The motion forced air through organic chambers, producing that low-frequency boom. It wasn't random. The beats had a rhythm. 3 long, 1 short. Pause, repeat. Communication, territorial display, or some evolutionary accident. It didn't matter. I'd found my catalyst. I watched from a ridge as the colossus passed below, its footsteps shaking leaves loose from the canopy. Smaller animals fled ahead of it, but none dared attack. It wasn't just its size that protected it. It was the sound. The ground quaked again. A blast of wind followed as it exhaled through heat vents along its ribs. Steam poured out and drifted up like a plume. I couldn't take the dish to the colossus, but I could bring the pulse back to the dish. I waited until it passed, then crept down to the trail it left behind. Bare clay, still warm. I knelt, pressed my palm to the dirt, still shaking. I took the crystal spike from my belt pouch, pushed it into the ground, and waited. The spike buzzed. I smiled. I recorded the rhythm into my field journal, marking time between pulses, noting the pressure response in the crystal. If I could simulate this pattern, just the low end, I might be able to reproduce the effect back at the relay frame. That meant building a sub-bass resonance chamber. I couldn't construct a full acoustic cavity without tools, but I could fake it. I collected hollow reeds from nearby, packed them with spore-rich moss, and embedded 2 of them around the dish's midline when I returned. The moss vibrated gently in the wind, amplifying low frequencies. When I struck one with a stick, it boomed softly. Primitive, but it worked. I copied the colossus rhythm onto the relay frame by thumping the moss-filled reeds at measured intervals. At first, nothing. Then the dish shimmered. The algae gel flexed, then contracted. A tiny crackle passed through the crystal nodes. No beam, no light, but a response. The system was listening. Now it just needed more energy. I pulled the capacitor jelly bulbs from their insulation shell and lined them around the relay base. Each one glowed faintly, flickering in time with the dish rhythm, responding to the moss thumps. One even sparked against the dirt. I backed away, breath held, and waited. Then the center crystal flared, just once. A bright, clean pulse of blue-white light shot from its tip, upward through the trees. It vanished in less than a second, but I saw it. The dish worked. I dropped to my knees, laughed, even. Just once, exhausted. It wasn't a message, not yet. It wasn't a signal, not yet. But it was a pulse, and it went somewhere. Even if no one heard it, even if the sky swallowed it whole. It was a start. I wrote in the journal with shaking fingers. Day 6. Drumback sauropod located. Used rhythmic pulse to mimic acoustic catalyst. Relay dish responded. First successful pulse achieved. Strength low. Direction vertical. Duration 0.8 seconds. Response unknown. Tomorrow I'd refine the signal, and then I'd send another, louder, longer, until something answered or nothing ever did. I returned to the relay site at dawn and began testing pulse intervals. The drum pattern from the Colossus had worked once, but the signal strength was weak. I needed a longer charge build-up, a sharper release. Every time I struck the moss reeds in sequence, the dish shivered and sparked, but the pulse never lasted more than a second. By mid-morning, I could feel the heat of the sun directly overhead, thicker than yesterday. The air turned still, no breeze, the leaves didn't move, even the insects went quiet. Something was off. I stepped back from the relay frame and scanned the tree line. Everything was still, too still. Then I felt it, a tension in the air, not vibration, not heat, a pressure, and the silence broke. One bird, a sharp, panicked screech, and then nothing again. I turned slowly and saw her, the Tyrannosaurus Rex. She stepped out of the forest like she'd always been there, as if the trees parted because she willed them to. At least 15 meters long, her body moved with heavy, effortless grace. She didn't stomp, she flowed. Her shoulders were broader than I expected, hips powerful, each step a perfect counterbalance of muscle and tail. Feathers lined her spine in a thick ridge, the color of scorched charcoal. Not soft feathers, no, these were dense, armor-like, quill-stiff. Her snout was long, narrower than textbook models, and her eyes were forward, binocular. Hunter's eyes. She locked onto me the instant she emerged. I didn't move, didn't breathe. She advanced. One slow step, then another. Her throat flushed, a deep electric blue rippling up the underside of her jaw like heat lightning. I knew the coloration wasn't decorative. It was a warning. I stepped backward once. She didn't follow. She stood motionless, watching. We stared at each other for a long time. The only sound was the faint crackle of the dish's algae membrane behind me. Then she growled. Not a roar, not the Hollywood scream, a low teeth-grinding rasp. Half vocal, half a hiss. It reverberated through the clearing. She took a step forward. I backed up, one pace at a time, never turning away. Then a memory flashed, one I didn't know I had stored. The crock capacitors, the sap vial, the reed gel, the charge that stunned the voltage dial. I reached into my pouch and pulled out the pack, still intact, just enough for one arc. My hands moved without thought. I dipped the stylus tip into the gel, snapped a glass shard, and connected the exposed ends to the jelly bulb's spike. The circuit sparked. The T-Rex tensed, 1 foot raised. I flung the sparking pack into the air in front of her. The detonation was instant. Small, a burst of blue-white light and ozone-rich vapor. The T-Rex screamed, not in pain but rage. Her eyes squeezed shut. She twisted away, tail lashing, and bulldozed into the tree line in 2 steps, vanishing with an explosion of splintered bark and shaking leaves. Gone. I didn't run, couldn't. I just stood there, breath heaving, gel still stinging my fingers. The clearing reeked of smoke and electricity. I sat down, right there in the dirt, and laughed. The dish flickered behind me, weak, reactive, pulsing in response to the residual charge. I turned to it and smiled. She hadn't killed me, and better yet, the spark arc had stimulated the dish. Without any reed thump, no moss drum, just lightning. That meant a shortcut. If I could get another reaction like that, controlled, I wouldn't need a steady drum pulse. I'd only need a discharge strong enough to trigger the crystal's full range. A storm could do it, or a larger refined capacitor. I logged the encounter while my hands still shook. Day 7. Tyrannosaurus encounter. Feathered, forward-facing vision. Throat flushes electric blue during active threat. No visible call. Response to electric arc confirmed. Temporary sensory stun. Not injured. Confirmed dish response to arc burst. Implication: dish can be pulse activated via electrical discharge. I closed the journal and set it on the dirt. I didn't expect to survive this long, and I sure as hell didn't expect her. But I had survived, and I had a working dish. All I needed now was a storm, or something worse. The next morning, I chased the storm. Not metaphorically, literally. A rolling front had appeared on the southern horizon just before dawn, low and smeared like charcoal smoke pressed against the sky. No lightning, no rain, just dust, dragging the sun behind it like a curtain. That meant wind, static, maybe even strikes. I packed light, crystals, spare gel, the reinforced stylus, and set off before the light turned full amber. The jungle thinned quickly in that direction. Trees gave way to dry scrub, then to a cracked expanse of earth that shimmered with heat before I even stepped onto it. I'd reached the sand sea, not dunes, not soft desert. The ground here was flat and tightly packed for long stretches, then abruptly loose, a fine powder that collapsed underfoot if you lingered. The wind painted waves into it, delicate crests like ripples on water. I moved cautiously, staying to the firmer ridges and testing each step with a shard of driftwood. 5 minutes in, I felt the first vibration, a low, gritty scrape. Subterranean. I froze. The sand rose near my right boot, not from wind, from underneath. I leapt back as the surface broke, something roiling beneath, not surfacing but rolling past like a massive fish swimming under fabric. The dune collapsed behind it, and then it disappeared. I scanned the horizon. A second ripple, larger, crossed my path at a distance. No form visible, just a distortion, like heat mirage over boiling water. Then a fin broke the surface, a dorsal sail, ridged and glistening, streaked with rust-red skin and gray spines. It cut across the dune without a sound. An ankylosaurid, but adapted for sand. Its shell was flatter, segmented for flex, legs tucked. Instead of walking, it swam through the dunes, propelled by tail and the massive rudder of its back fin. The spines across its back pulsed faintly, shedding heat. That made sense. The sand sea would trap heat like an oven. Anything hunting here had to keep moving or cook from the inside out. Another fin followed, then another. A pack, burrowing sailbacks, coordinated from the way they moved, parallel, then circling. I crouched low behind a rock outcrop, the only solid feature in a quarter mile. My pack pressed tight against my spine. I stayed still, letting the heat roll past in waves. The creatures didn't surface. They only swam, just below, waiting. Predators? Maybe. But they weren't hunting me. They were feeding on something else. I realized this when one of them stopped, curled its body upward and drove its tail spike into the sand like a pick. The ground burst upward. A fat, flailing insect, a grub the size of a deer, thrashed into the air, shrieking in some reedy, fluted tone. The ankylosaurid swallowed it whole and dove again. I moved quietly, tracking the path they cleared, sticking to the hardened ridges where their presence had compressed the sand. An hour in, the storm overtook me. Wind howled over the ridgeline, sending fine dust across the plains in sheets. Visibility dropped to 20 meters. The sun disappeared. My eyes stung, and my mouth filled with grit. I tied a strip of moss wrap across my face and kept moving. Then the thunder started. Dry thunder, no rain, just pressure. The storm was building static. My hair lifted. The stylus in my belt sparked once against my canteen clip. Then I saw it. Lightning. Not in the sky, in the sand. A flash jumped between two dunes, just a foot tall, a snap of blue-white charge that danced along the surface, arcing between metal-rich grains. I dropped to the ground and watched. Again, it struck. Low, fast, a pulse of ground-hugging electricity like a serpent made of light. This was it. The sand sea didn't just produce storms, it stored them. Every footstep, every shift in the wind, every sailback that cut the crust open. They were building a network of charge. The storm fed it, and in turn it crawled across the ground like veins. I needed to harvest some of that energy. I pulled the jelly bulbs from my pack and placed 3 in a triangular pattern on the sand. then stuck my longest crystal into the center. Then I waited. The wind howled louder, sand whipped across my back. One of the sailbacks surfaced just 50 meters away, paused, then dove again, oblivious. Then, flash, the charge struck the crystal directly. All 3 jelly bulbs lit up, brighter than ever, then hissed and twitched like living things, their membranes bubbling from overload. I lunged forward and pulled the crystal out before it shattered. 2 of the bulbs went dark, one still glowed, overloaded but intact. That one I kept. I'd never get another chance like this. I made the long hike back in near darkness, the sun now just a stain in the western clouds. By the time I reached the ridge, the wind had died. The clearing was still, the relay frame untouched. I inserted the charged jelly bulb into the base housing, careful not to snap the leads. The dish immediately responded. All 5 crystal nodes flickered, then stabilized into a low blue glow. This wasn't a pulse, this was readiness. I logged the day with trembling hands. Day 8. Encountered burrowing ankylosaurids adapted for sand sea locomotion. Sailback fins used for steering and heat regulation. Observed ground-level lightning behavior, dry storm, static field arcing between dunes. Successfully harvested pulse via embedded crystal. Result, relay frame now in active standby. One more charge like that, and the dish might broadcast. Not just flicker, speak. And tomorrow, I'd make it shout. The relay was alive. I barely slept. The moment the sand-charged jelly bulb connected, the dish entered a low hum that didn't stop. Not overnight, not even during the brief wind gusts that passed through the canopy before dawn. The dish's crystal tips glowed steadily, and faint pulses of algae gel shimmered down its arch, like veins pulsing with breath. But it still wasn't sending. Not truly, not pushing. The components were ready. But it needed one last thing, a focusing layer. Something that could convert the directional energy into a coherent signal. Without it, any blast of power would scatter. So I headed into Cloak Valley. I'd seen it days before on the climb to the termite spire, a narrow ravine to the east choked in fog that never burned off. The air had tasted metallic even from the edge. A shimmer clung to the stone walls, and the trees leaned inward like they were hiding something. When I entered, my compass gyros spun once, then froze. The fog wasn't normal. It wasn't moisture-based. It was laced with iron dust so fine it hung in suspension, tinting the light orange and muting every sound. Even my own footsteps went silent. The air deadened everything. No insects, no birds, just silence, pressing against my ears until I could hear my own pulse. Then came the movement. A herd. Dozens of hadrosaurids, not the coral saurs I'd seen before, but larger, flatter-faced, with wide bellies and eyes that blinked sideways. Their skin moved, not like muscle, not like breathing, color. Their flanks swam with slow waves of pigmentation, not random, not camouflage, language. They were communicating by hue. One flashed bands of red and blue when another came too close. A third rippled with orange and green along its ribs, then stopped when a fourth passed. It wasn't just instinct, it was conversation. I stayed low in the brush as the herd meandered through the fog, their bodies adapted to the muted light, skin shimmering with a soft sheen, like oil over water. Then I noticed the small ones. Juveniles darted between the adults, but they didn't have the same skins. Instead, they were coated in bacteria, patchy fields of color that responded to nearby adults, imitating their messages. Living chromatophores, cultivated. The young weren't born with pigment, they grew it. Bacteria passed down from parent to child, specific to each herd. I watched a calf rear up on its hind legs, smearing its flank against its mother's side to paint itself in a matching stripe. A cultural signature. And, more importantly, responsive coloration. If I could extract a sample and culture it across the dish's surface, I could build a reactive lens, one that altered based on charge, vibration, or heat. The perfect modulator. It would focus the signal the same way these creatures focus their language. I tracked the herd through the mist for an hour before they settled in a low clearing, ringed with wet stone and iron-tipped ferns. The adults dozed, the calves played. I crept forward. One calf had strayed toward a mineral patch, smearing its body against the rock in long, slow motions. I reached out with a shard of bark and scraped along the stone after it passed. The slime glowed faintly green. It reacted to my touch with a shimmer of blue. Not random, sensitive. I stored the slime in a carved-out chunk of moss resin, then retreated the way I came. The fog clung to me. My mouth tasted like blood from the iron, but when I emerged into the light above the valley, the silence dropped away, like stepping out of a vacuum. I returned to the ridge by mid-afternoon. The relay dish hummed louder now, as if it felt my approach. I smeared the pigment gel across the inner curve of the dish, careful to coat every angle evenly. The moment it contacted the crystal lattice, it reacted, changing from green to a flat, glassy black, light-absorbing, a lens, perfect. I struck the reed drum in the pattern of the drum-back sauropod. The pigment shifted, from black to deep violet, then a narrow band of white light traced the spine of the dish from bottom to tip. A new pulse fired, longer this time, brighter. The air smelled like ozone and copper. I dropped to my knees and watched the pigment shimmer down the dish surface, then settle, alive, not just transmitting, translating. I logged the day with shaking hands. Day 9. Cloak Valley expedition successful. Located hadrosaurid herd using skin bacteria chromatophores for nonverbal language. Sample collected. Applied to dish. Result, dynamic color shift in response to signal pulse. Focus layer established. Signal confirmed. The dish was no longer just a frame. It was a mouth, and tomorrow it would speak. I climbed at dawn. The ridge that flanked the eastern perimeter of the forest gave way to a sharp uplift of black stone, cliffs crusted in pale ash like a fossilized wave had been frozen mid-collapse. Wind howled across the summit. The air reeked of sulfur and decay, and tiny flurries of ash floated down like snow, coating my arms, stinging my nose. The signal dish was ready. More than ready. The frame was stable. The pigment lens was responsive. The jelly bulbs still pulsed faintly in standby. But I needed one more refinement, fine control. A modulation pattern. A way to shape the signal, not just blast it upward like a scream in the dark. The only place left to find something delicate enough for that task was here, because from this elevation I could see the vents. Cracked into the black rock were rows of circular fissures, maybe a meter wide, hissing steady streams of gas into the air. It wasn't smoke, it was vapor, thin, white, and rhythmic. The vents didn't breathe randomly. They pulsed, cycled, like bellows. And clinging to the ledges above them, pterosaurs, dozens. I dropped to my belly and crawled to the nearest outcrop. They were larger than any bat I'd seen, wingspans easily 4 meters, mottled skin, beaks curved down, hook-tipped. But the strangest feature wasn't their wings or heads, it was their tongues. Long segmented appendages flicked from their mouths and dipped into the vents. They were feeding off the gas, not just breathing it, drinking it. The tongues glowed faintly, and every so often, a pterosaur would let out a soft, pulsing screech that matched the hiss of the vent beneath it. They were tuning, using the vents as natural resonance chambers. I watched them for 10 minutes. Every cry was a response. They weren't just animals. They were modulating the gas to suit their calls, and their calls shifted depending on the rhythm of the vents. A living feedback loop, modulation, signal shaping. Exactly what I needed. I took out my stylus and slowly inched closer to one of the lower vents. The ash was ankle-deep and crusted in layers. My boots broke through more than once, revealing glowing seams of sulfur-rich stone underneath. The vent hissed harder here. Heat licked my skin. My eyes watered, but I knelt beside it and held my hand above the opening. The pulses were consistent, a pattern, almost mechanical. I reached into my pack, pulled out a hollow reed tube and held it across the vent. The gas passed through and whistled, low and warbling. I rotated the reed slowly. The pitch shifted. It worked. The vent could modulate a tone. If I positioned similar tubes on the relay dish, aligned to capture the algae pulse and shape it as it passed, I could control signal content, not just direction. That's when the first scream hit. High above, one of the pterosaurs screeched. Not a pulse this time. An alarm. The others stirred instantly. Wings flared. Heads swiveled. I turned, saw what they saw. A new shape crested the far ridge. No feathers, no scales, just gray glossy skin stretched taut over elongated limbs. It wasn't a dinosaur. It wasn't anything I recognized. Its body looked poured, like it had melted and been stitched back together wrong. Long arms, too many joints, and a head like a shark skull flared open sideways. It didn't walk, it glided across the rock like wind. Every pterosaur took off at once, the sky filled with leathery wings and panicked screeches. I backed away. The thing ignored them. It moved toward the vents. The ground cracked beneath it, not with weight but pressure, as if its presence forced the earth to split. I didn't stick around. I sprinted down the slope, sliding through ash, lungs burning, pack flapping. Behind me I heard nothing, no pursuit, just the wind and the sick, slow hissing of a vent being consumed. Back at the relay, I collapsed near the base and fumbled the reed tube from my belt. It still worked, still whistled, still caught the wind and shaped it. I mounted it to the dish, angled against the algae membrane, set to catch the pulse once the final trigger hit. This would be the shaper, the final piece. That thing on the cliff, it wasn't part of this system. It didn't belong. Not here. Not in this ecosystem. Every animal I'd seen until now had purpose, place, evolution. But that was wrong. I logged what I could before my hands stopped shaking. Day 10. Ash cliffs home to vent-fed pterosaurs with signal modulation vocalizations. Vents pulse sulfur-rich gas in stable rhythms. Reeds tuned to these frequencies provide pitch control. Harvested modulation reed and mounted to dish. Signal shaping now possible. Unidentified entity encountered. Non-dinosaur. Anomalous locomotion. Biological mismatch. Avoid. I closed the journal. The dish stood tall, humming in the dark. Tomorrow, I would fire it. Not a flicker, not a spark. Full signal. The relay dish was complete. The capacitor jelly bulbs glowed steady now, no flicker. The algae membrane tightened in smooth waves when the wind hit just right. Every crystal node thrummed with residual charge. The modulation reeds sang faintly in the early breeze. All it needed was the trigger, a storm, a strike, or one final charge strong enough to force the dish into full broadcast. I knew where to find it. The fen. I'd avoided it until now. The bog that spread west of the termite tower, always steaming, always murmuring like a mouthful of water. It looked shallow at a glance, but I knew better. I'd seen how things vanished there, not just animals, shapes, entire forms gone beneath the surface like they'd never existed. But I also remembered the moss, not the kind that grew on trees, the kind that floated, reddish, oily, puffed full of spores and clinging to the surface of the mire like a blanket of skin. It reacted to movement. When things stirred the water, it pulsed. Tiny ripples of bioluminescence would flash out in rings. I'd seen it from the ridge, light without fire, without spark. It was storing something, and the water, it whispered when it moved, as if there was something beneath it all, something old, something too large. That's where I was going. I left before sunrise, armed only with the stylus, a single jelly bulb, and my last intact shard of conductive crystal. I kept my footsteps light and skirted the dry edge of the bog until I found a narrow inlet. The water there was black-green and coated in a soft layer of the moss. I tested it with a stick. It went down 3 feet before hitting anything solid. Too deep to walk, too unstable to swim. so I built a bridge. Dead limbs, hollow trunks, vines twisted and tied until I had a floating raft no larger than a door frame. It groaned when I stepped on it, but it held. I pushed off into the mire. The air was heavy, sour, and quiet in a way that made my ears ring. Beneath the raft, shapes stirred. Not large, not yet, just hints, fish with transparent skulls, leeches that swam like eels. Nothing rose. Everything waited. I made it 200 meters before the moss began to glow. Faint at first, blue pinpoints in the water that blinked and faded, then returned stronger. The jelly bulb in my pack began to pulse in response, sinking to the glow without contact. Perfect. I dropped anchor, a rock tied to vine, and tested the water with my stylus. Voltage faint, rising. I took out the jelly bulb and held it just above the surface. The glow intensified. Then the moss pulled downward, like something breathing in. The raft jerked sideways. I dropped to my knees and braced. A ripple crossed the surface behind me, wide, deep. I turned slowly. Nothing. Then bubbles. Dozens, frothed up in a perfect ring behind the raft. I didn't move. The bubbles stopped. Then the water split. Something rose, slowly. First a bulge of black-green sludge, then a dome of wet bone, then an eye the size of a melon sheathed in a translucent lid that blinked vertically. The skull kept rising until the water rolled off its jaw in sheets, revealing a mouth full of plates, not teeth like a whale's baleen, but curved and stained with silt. An amphibian, but wrong, too long. Its neck arched as it surfaced fully, 20 feet of spine, slick and jointed. Its body remained beneath, but the bulk displaced enough water to tilt the raft. Then it opened its mouth, not to bite, to inhale. Water surged inward with a roar, dragging dead moss, insects, fish, and current. A vacuum. The jelly bulb in my hand pulsed bright and overloaded. Sparks shot from the crystal spike. I jammed the bowl back into its moss-wrapped shell and pulled it close. The beast didn't attack. It drifted closer, then sank with a slow, bubbling groan. Gone. The water went still. The bulb throbbed in my hand like a living heart. Charged, overcharged, too much for a slow return. It had to be fired now. I kicked the raft toward the edge of the bog, paddling with broken branches until the reeds returned. I didn't stop moving until I reached the ridge. The relay dish waited in silence. The pigment lens had gone black, waiting. I climbed the platform and drove the spike into the jelly bulb, then into the core node at the dish's center. The pulse hit instantly. The dish bucked. A low-frequency shockwave cracked outward through the forest, scattering birds in every direction. The modulation reed screamed, catching the pulse and splitting it into 3 distinct harmonics. Then the dish fired, upward, not a beam, not light, a column of distortion. The air above the dish warped like heat over asphalt. The color bled out of the sky for a full second, replaced by gray silence. Then it was gone. The forest held its breath. No explosion, no echo, just stillness. I collapsed beside the dish and stared at the sky, waiting. No response came. Not right away. But I wrote in my journal, Day 11, entered mire, encountered massive amphibian predator, designated gulper newt, filter feeding behavior, water vacuum siphon, captured electrical current from moss layer during feeding, bulb overloaded, return to ridge, final signal test success. Full modulation discharge sustained 2.3 seconds. Direction, vertical, response, unknown. And then I added, I fired the flare. Now I wait. The pattern continued through the night. Click, 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 click. Then silence. Then it repeated. Always the same sequence. Always the same spacing, not random, but not intelligent either. I listened to it until my ears ached from the repetition. I wrote it down a dozen times, tested variations in spacing, cross-referenced it against bird calls, seismic patterns, even the drumbeat of the sauropod. None matched exactly. Then I tried something different. I walked out past the dish and tapped the earth with my foot in the same rhythm. Click, 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 click. Nothing changed. Then I tapped back, this time adding a beat. Click, 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 click. The dish didn't pulse, didn't glow, but the air did. A faint shimmer passed through the pigment lens. The entire frame flexed slightly as if the dish inhaled. Then, deep in the trees behind me, a groan, low, rolling, not mechanical, not bestial, organic. A tree shook, then another. Birds lifted from the canopy like smoke. The forest moved. Not just an animal, not a herd. The entire forest was responding. A feedback loop. This was the pulse the biosphere had always known. I hadn't sent a signal into space, I'd sent it into the ground, into the system itself. And it had answered the only way it knew how, with movement. Then the horizon lit up. At first I thought it was the sun, a streak of gold across the ridgeline. But it was too bright, too fast, and it crackled. Fire. A bolt of dry lightning had struck somewhere east, igniting the drought-thin underbrush. I watched a plume rise into the orange sky and knew what would follow. Stampede. And I was in its path. I didn't run. There was nowhere to run. The relay frame couldn't be moved, and I wouldn't abandon it. Not now. Not after the world had finally spoken back. So I worked. Fast. I lashed the frame tighter with vine, buried the base in wet soil, smeared my last pouch of algae gel across the joints to prevent cracking from heat shock. Then I dug a trench, shallow, pathetic, just enough for me to lie in if the herd came close. Then I waited. The earth began to tremble, not from the fire, from them. A chorus of creatures emerged from the tree line. First the sauropods, enormous bodies wobbling with each panicked stride, their tails slicing low through ferns like scythes. Then the horned ones, their frills dark with soot, snorting, blinking against the smoke. Then smaller shapes, beetles, lizards, gliders all scrambling across roots and down ridges. And then insects, thousands of them, some the size of my fist, others as large as birds. Their wings didn't beat, they hummed, vibrating in a way that synced with the earlier pulse. They weren't just fleeing, they were reacting to it, returning it. Click, 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 click. The fire came into view, crawling over the treetops in long, writhing fingers. The smoke turned the air brown. The heat peeled bark from trunks with a pop, and branches cracked like ribs. A group of ceratopsians came next, frills flickering as they passed, some lighting up in the exact pattern I'd heard hours before. They weren't calling to each other. They were repeating the signal. The dish shuddered. One of the crystal nodes cracked under strain but held. A final wave of creatures poured out of the smoke. Unidentified quadrupeds with massive flanks and ribbed flapping fins that glowed like burning coal. They ran with heads down, teeth bared not in rage but in instinct. They didn't look, didn't see me, didn't touch the relay. They parted around it. The dish stood untouched as the wave broke around it. Because it was part of the rhythm now, the herd recognized it, not as a threat, not even as a tool, as another voice. I crawled out of my trench, coughing, my face slick with sweat and ash. The sky above was orange-gray. The air buzzed with residual heat, but the dish still pulsed, and the clicking, gone, replaced with silence, not emptiness, not rejection. Completion. Like a song that no longer needed to be repeated because the chorus had been received. I sat beside the frame, knees to my chest, and stared at the sky. The stars would return soon, but I wasn't waiting for them, not anymore, because now I understood. By morning the fire had eaten itself out. It left behind a scorched border along the edge of the forest, blackened trunks, smoldering underbrush, a soft wind that carried the scent of carbon and old life into the east. The animals were gone. The herd, the beetles, the color-pulsing frilled giants, all of them, and yet the feeling remained. Like the silence after a song, the dish still stood, humming faintly, not charging, not waiting, just present. No more pulses, no flashes, no replies. And the modulation reed, once twitching with signal, now hung limp. That wasn't failure, it was confirmation. This world had answered. It had sent its reply, not with words, but with action, with resonance, with recognition. And now it had gone still again, folding me into the quiet like one more stone in a canyon. That's what brought me west. I needed to see where the signal had ended. The relay had reached something ancient and deep. I didn't know how far it traveled underground, how many layers of soil and root and stone it had threaded through, but I knew it left a mark, a destination, so I followed the quiet, down a dried stream bed, along fault lines I hadn't noticed before, past slabs of slate torn open like a cracked spine. The terrain changed gradually. Trees gave way to scrub, then scrub gave way to walls, stone, eroded and vast, baked in the heat of 1,000 dawns. A canyon, narrow but tall, stretched like a wound through the old bones of the world. I followed it in. The first glyph appeared less than 30 meters down. At first, I mistook it for natural weathering, a striation in the stone worn by wind and water. But it wasn't. The lines were too clean, too sharp, etched with purpose. I knelt and traced them with one finger, 7 grooves, parallel, each separated by the exact same width. No variation, and they weren't carved with tools. They'd been scraped, again and again over centuries. Tail clubs, horns, beaks. Thousands of generations of animals had passed through this canyon, etching the same grooves in the same places, reinforcing the marks until they sank centimeters into the stone. Some of the grooves intersected, others bent at angles, diverged, met again further down. None were random. It was a map, not for directions, for timing. The spacing matched the signal. The same pulse rhythm I'd heard from the dish and from the ceratopsians, the same vibration I'd felt from the drum-backed sauropods. Each groove represented a moment, a signal burst. Not language, but beat. Movement, a memory carved into stone not by conscious minds, but by persistent action. I moved deeper into the canyon. More grooves appeared. Dozens, hundreds. On one wall, a pattern of chevrons, 3 down, 1 up. Repeated. Matched the modulation pattern on the reed. Another symbol, concentric circles around a central point, each ring made of claw marks. I remembered the algae flow in the trench, spiraling like a lens. It all connected. The dish hadn't spoken into the void. It had entered a system already in motion. A world that communicated not with words, but pressure, with color, with frequency, with shape. And the canyon was its memory. I sat in the middle of it, sun bleeding down the walls, and listened. The wind carried no voice, but the stone vibrated. I placed my palm against a groove and felt it, a slow, soft rhythm. The world's pulse, not rapid, not panicked. Just steady, just alive. I opened the journal and wrote the final entry of the Signal Project. Day 13. Canyon discovered west of Relay. Stone marked with multi-generational glyph patterns, parallel, directional, rhythmic. Matches previous bioelectric and behavioral signatures. Implies long-standing terrestrial resonance network. Signal not received by mind or machine, but by ecosystem memory. Message accepted. Response completed. No further transmission required. I paused, then added, they heard me, and I was not foreign. I was not alien. I was just early. Because I understood now. I hadn't come to observe the past. I'd arrived in time to become part of it. I returned to the ridge one last time. The relay dish stood silent now. The crystal nodes no longer pulsed. The pigment lens had faded to dull gray. The modulation reed hung limp, lifeless, as if the wind no longer remembered its name. And that was fine. It wasn't broken. It was finished. I sat beside it and looked out across the valley. Smoke still hung low where the fire had passed days before, curling in long black ribbons over the tree line. But new green shoots were already pushing through the ash. The moss had begun to breathe again, slow, shallow inhales through the scorched soil. Insects hummed along the edges of the fern canopy like nothing had happened. This world didn't stop, it absorbed, and somewhere out there, in root and rock and scale, my signal had joined the rhythm. No one was coming for me. Not because they didn't care, because they couldn't, because the breach that brought me here wasn't a doorway, it was a puncture, one way, irreversible. Time, like biology, flowed in one direction here. And I'd flowed with it. For a while I thought about building a monument, a stone tower, a message scratched into bark, something to be found, but it didn't matter. Not anymore, because this whole world was memory. It didn't need my name carved into it. It remembered me in the grooves of the canyon, the pigments on the dish. The sulfur-slicked reeds still singing faintly when the wind passed through them. Instead, I built shelter, nothing grand, a semicircle of volcanic stones stacked shoulder-high, mortared with termite resin and ash. I roofed it with fire-hardened fronds and lined the interior with moss that smelled faintly of cinnamon and wet stone. It was enough to keep the rain off, enough to stay warm, and more than enough to think. I gathered sap and jelly bulbs. I repaired what I could of the field journal. The last pages were running low, but I had etched so much into these leaves that I no longer needed them. The memory was here, in the air, in the animals, in the land. Some nights I still hear the echo. Click, 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 click. Not from the dish, from the forest. A call, repeated in the distance, not for me, but around me. Part of the cycle now, one beat among many. The dish had spoken a language that the world had not forgotten. And the world had answered, not with words, but with space. It made room for me. And in return, I made a promise to observe, to remember, to never mistake silence for absence again. Not in this world, and never in any to come. I close the journal now with the final entry. Day 20. I am not lost. I am not stranded. I am not dead. I am Elias Finch. Biologist, castaway, witness. I remain where time left me, and the world listens still. The wind sings through the reeds, and I sing with it.